She had learned long ago how to live with being overlooked, not because she was weak and not because she lacked the will to fight, but because the world had made it clear, over and over again, in small and large ways, that the overlooked were expected to stay that way. She was the youngest daughter of a farming family that had worked the same land in the flat, wind-scraped plains of the Central Valley for 3 generations. The farm was not glamorous by any measure. Its fields produced grain and feed corn in decent years, barely enough to break even in bad ones. The soil was honest, but unforgiving, demanding everything from the people who worked it, and offering back only what it decided they deserved. Her name was Cecilia, though most people in her family simply called her C, and the way they said it had always carried a faint note of dismissal, as though the shortened name itself was a reminder of how little she warranted their full attention. She was the youngest child of 5 after her brother Marcus passed from illness at 19, and somehow both positions had taught her the same lesson. There was always someone else who mattered more. Always another sibling whose needs came first, whose voice was louder, whose future seemed more worth protecting. Their father, Elias Drummond, had spent his entire adult life on the farm. He was a man of few words and even fewer concessions, the kind of man who believed that land was the only honest thing in the world, the only thing that could not lie to you if you were willing to work it properly. He had inherited the farm from his own father and had grown it slowly, or purchasing adjacent parcels whenever money allowed, clearing windbreaks of old cottonwood and elm trees along the property edges to protect his crops from the brutal spring winds that rolled unchecked across the open plain. Cecilia had worked beside him since she was old enough to hold a tool. She had walked the furrows in the early morning cold, checked irrigation lines in summer heat that made the air shimmer above the fields, and mended fences in the dark while her older siblings stayed inside. She did not resent the work. She loved it in the particular, wordless way that some people love things they cannot fully explain. The smell of turned earth, the sound of the wind moving through the stands of trees along the farm's perimeter, the way the light fell across the fields at evening and made everything look briefly, impossibly golden. Her siblings had their own relationships with the farm. Her brother Raymond, the eldest, had always understood himself to be its natural inheritor. He spoke about the land with the authority of someone who had already decided it belonged to him, even years before their father's health began to fail. Her sister Darlene managed the farm's books and had built her identity around numbers, around the clean certainty of profit and loss, around the argument that sentiment had no place in serious decisions. The 2 remaining siblings, Paul and Vivienne, had left the county years earlier for cities and careers that had nothing to do with farming. They returned only at holidays, opinions already formed, patience already thin. When their father's illness became impossible to ignore, the family began talking about the future in the way families do when they are not yet ready to be honest about what they mean. They spoke about planning, about responsibility, about ensuring that everything their father had built would be properly carried forward. What they meant, and what became clear over the months of his slow decline, was that decisions had already been made. Not formally, not yet, but the shape of those decisions had been sketched out in the quiet conversations that Cecilia was never invited to join. She had noticed, during those months, how the dynamic shifted whenever the topic of inheritance arose at the dinner table. Raymond would sit up slightly straighter, his voice taking on a quality she could only describe as managerial, as though he had already assumed the role of decision-maker and was simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Darlene would pull a small notebook from the pocket of whatever cardigan she was wearing and begin making notes, her pen moving in quick, business-like strokes. Paul and Vivian would exchange glances across the table, their faces carrying the particular careful expression of people who want something but have not yet decided how hard they are willing to work for it. Cecilia would sit quietly and eat her food and watch them and say very little. She had learned early that the quietest person in any room was the one who heard the most. And what she heard, assembled from fragments and implications and the silences between spoken sentences, was that the conversations being held at the dinner table were not the real conversations. The real conversations were happening elsewhere, in smaller combinations, in phone calls made when she was not around, in the understood agreements that formed between people who have decided how things should go before the formal discussion has even begun. She learned about the will the same way she had learned most important things in her family, after the fact, in passing, from someone who assumed she already knew. Raymond mentioned it at the kitchen table one evening, casually, the way you mention something that does not require careful handling. Their father had divided the farm among the 5 of them, but the division was not equal. Raymond would receive the main fields, the equipment barn, the irrigation infrastructure, and the farmhouse itself. Darlene would receive the east parcel, smaller but productive. Paul and Vivian would each receive a financial stake, a buyout of their share, which had already been calculated and set aside. Cecilia would receive the Windbreak. The Windbreak was a strip of land running along the western edge of the farm, roughly 400 meters long and no more than 30 meters wide at its broadest point. It was planted with old cottonwood trees, some of them enormous, their trunks thick as barrels, their roots spreading wide and deep beneath the surface. The strip had been planted by her grandfather decades ago to slow the wind and protect the crops from erosion. It had no irrigation. It produced nothing. It was not farmable in any meaningful sense, by every practical measure, so it was the least valuable thing on the property. Raymond explained this without apology. The Windbreak was still land, he said. Technically, it had value. It was not nothing. He used the word technically twice in the same sentence, and each time he said it, the word felt like a small, careful blade. Darlene added that the timber from the trees had some market value if she ever decided to clear the strip, and she said it in the tone of someone offering a minor consolation that they themselves do not find particularly consoling. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of her family since she was a girl, and she was not about to start now. She sat at the table and looked at the surface of her coffee and said that she understood. Paul and Vivian, present by phone, said little. The silence they offered felt like agreement, or something close enough to it that it didn't matter. That night, alone in the small room she still kept in the farmhouse during her visits, Cecilia lay awake and ran the numbers in her head without meaning to. The farm had roughly 1,200 acres of workable land. The Windbreak strip was perhaps 12 acres at most, barely 1% of the whole. Her father had spent 40 years building something, and she was to receive the edge of it, the part that existed only to protect everything else, the part no one ever thought about unless the wind came. The grief she felt was not simple. It was layered in the particular way that grief is when it is not entirely about the thing you have lost, but about what that thing confirms. Her father had loved her. She believed that without reservation. But love and recognition were not the same thing, and her father had been a man of his era, shaped by assumptions he never thought to question. The farm had always been Raymond's in his mind. The rest had been a matter of working out the details. The smallest detail had been Cecilia. People in the county heard about the inheritance arrangement quickly. Small communities have their own systems of communication, not gossip exactly, but the accumulated awareness that comes from people living close to one another for a long time. The story that spread was simple and unsparing. Old Drummond had left the youngest one the trees, the part nobody wanted. People said it with a kind of sad shrug, not cruelty, but the particular resignation of those who recognize an old pattern playing itself out. Someone at the agricultural supplier where Cecilia worked heard about it from a customer and mentioned it to a coworker before anyone thought to wonder whether Cecilia might be within earshot. She was. She heard it. She did not say anything. She finished the inventory count she was working on and took her lunch break 10 minutes early and sat in her car in the parking lot until the feeling in her chest settled into something manageable. She spent the following weeks after the funeral managing her feelings the way she had always managed them, by staying busy, by moving through tasks with purpose, by not allowing herself to sit too long in the quiet places where the weight of things could catch up with her. She worked her regular job, a position managing inventory and logistics for a mid-size agricultural supplier 3 counties over, on competent work that used her mind without asking much of her heart. Her coworkers noticed something had shifted in her. She moved more carefully than before, more deliberately. She answered questions precisely and did not volunteer information beyond what was needed. One older woman who had worked alongside her for years asked gently if she was all right. Cecilia said yes, she was fine, and the older woman nodded and did not ask again, because there are some things in a person's expression that tell you plainly that fine means something complicated. What Cecilia did not tell her coworkers or her family or anyone at all was that she had started spending time at the Windbreak. She went on weekends at first, driving out to the western edge of the property in the early morning before her siblings were up, parking on the gravel track that ran alongside the tree line, and walking among the cottonwoods in the gray pre-dawn quiet. She told herself it was a kind of grief practice, a way of being near the farm that her father had loved without having to navigate the complicated emotional weather of being inside the farmhouse with her siblings. But that was not entirely honest, even to herself. The truth was that she had always felt something particular about the Windbreak. As a child, she had played among those trees, while her siblings worked the fields or sat inside. She had climbed the lower branches of the oldest cottonwoods, the ones whose trunks were so wide she could not wrap her arms around them, and sat in the high branches watching the wind move across the fields below. The trees had seemed alive to her in a way the fields never quite did, possessed of a quieter kind of presence, less productive, but more permanent. Now, walking among them as an adult, with the farm newly partitioned and her inheritance reduced to their shade, she noticed things she had not noticed before. The root systems were extraordinary. Where the soil had eroded slightly along the edges of the strip, the roots of the oldest trees were partially exposed, and they were massive, dark, complex structures that ran far deeper than she had imagined. In places, the ground above them was unusually raised, as if something beneath were exerting gentle, constant pressure upward. She had walked these trees her whole life. She thought she knew them. But grief has a way of slowing a person down, of making them look at familiar things differently. And in those slow, solitary morning walks, Cecilia began to look at her Windbreak the way she had never looked at anything, carefully, without assumption, without already knowing what she would find. What she found, at first, was nothing she could name. Only the sense that the ground beneath the oldest trees was different from the ground anywhere else on the farm. The soil did not behave the same way. In wet weather, it drained unusually fast in some places and retained moisture in others, in a pattern that seemed irregular compared to the surrounding fields. The roots near the central cluster of the oldest trees followed paths that curved and crossed in ways that seemed, if she let herself use that word, deliberate. She brought a hand trowel one morning and dug carefully near the exposed roots of the second largest tree, the one she had always called the sentinel tree as a child, because it stood slightly apart from the rest, angled slightly away from the others, as if keeping watch. What she found beneath the first layer of dark topsoil was a different color and texture than she expected. not the pale clay subsoil that characterized most of the valley's deeper layers. Something darker, denser, with a faint metallic quality that caught the low morning light differently than ordinary dirt should. She told herself she was imagining things. She was grieving. She was tired. She was constructing meaning where none existed, because the alternative, accepting that she had received the worthless edge of her father's life's work and that nothing would come of it, was too heavy to carry without some counterweight of hope. But she kept going back. Every weekend. Then some weekday evenings, walking the Windbreak as the season shifted and the cottonwoods moved through their changes, their leaves going gold and then letting go. The bare branches reaching upward in the cold months that followed, the whole strip becoming a different kind of place in winter, quieter, more skeletal, more honest in its structure. Her siblings noticed she was spending time there. Raymond mentioned it once with mild amusement, saying it was good that someone was keeping an eye on the trees, since nobody had any particular use for them, and the county had reminded him twice about deadfall removal requirements. Darlene said nothing, but her expression when Cecilia mentioned the windbreak in passing held a particular quality, not quite pity, but something adjacent to it, and the look you give someone who has made the best they can of a bad situation and deserves at least that much acknowledgement. Paul called from the city and asked in a well-meaning way whether she had thought about what she might do with her portion of the inheritance. He mentioned timber value, the possibility of clearing the strip for eventual sale, the idea that if the land were cleared, it might be absorbed into the adjacent fields and sold as part of a larger parcel. He was trying to help. She knew that. She said she was still thinking about it and let the conversation move elsewhere. What she did not say was that she had already spent money she did not have to spare on something she had not told anyone about. 3 weeks after the funeral, she had contacted a soil science professor at the State Agricultural University, on a woman whose research she had read years ago in connection with her logistics work. She had described the windbreak in general terms, the age of the trees, the behavior of the soil, the root patterns she had observed, the way the ground felt different underfoot in certain areas. She had asked, carefully, whether any of those things might indicate something worth knowing. The professor had been politely skeptical. Old-growth cottonwoods could develop unusual root structures, she said. Soil behavior near large root systems was often irregular. There were a number of explanations for what Cecilia was describing, most of them ordinary. But she had not dismissed the question entirely, and when Cecilia pressed, the professor had mentioned, almost as an aside, said that certain geological formations in that region of the valley had historically supported unusual mineral concentrations. The type and depth depended entirely on what lay beneath the surface. Without a proper survey, there was no way to know. A proper survey cost money Cecilia did not have. She used her savings anyway. She told herself it was a practical decision, that she was simply doing due diligence on an asset she owned, that any reasonable landowner would want to know what their property contained. But the real reason was simpler and harder to admit. She needed the windbreak to be worth something. Not for vanity, and not to prove anything to her siblings. She needed it to be worth something because she had given her whole life to that farm, and she was not ready to accept that her portion of it amounted to nothing more than a strip of old trees and the shade they cast. She arranged the soil survey for a Saturday in early spring, when the ground had thawed enough to take samples, but before her siblings would be likely to notice activity on the western edge of the property. She met the survey team at 7 in the morning, 2 technicians from a company out of the state capital, professional and unhurried, carrying equipment she recognized from her logistics work, but had never seen used up close. They began at the northern end of the windbreak and worked south, taking core samples at regular intervals, pausing near the oldest trees to take additional samples at varying depths. Cecilia walked with them answering their questions about the tree ages as best she could, pointing out the areas where the soil behavior had seemed most unusual to her. One of the technicians, a younger woman with a methodical manner, crouched near the root system of the largest cottonwood and examined the soil closely, pressing it between her fingers, then looking up with an expression that was difficult to read. That look stayed with Cecilia. She had spent enough years in logistics reading the faces of inspectors and auditors and analysts to know the difference between the expression of someone finding what they expected and the expression of someone finding something else entirely. The technician's face had been the second kind. She had looked at the soil beneath her fingers, and then she had looked at the core sample she had just extracted, and there had been a brief, controlled pause in her movements, the kind of pause that comes when a person is deciding how to proceed. She had not said anything. She had simply continued her work with perhaps slightly more care than she had applied to the earlier samples, moving to additional depths, taking a second core from the same location at a slightly different angle, bagging each sample with attention that exceeded what the job technically required. Cecilia had watched all of this and said nothing, because she had the sense that any comment she made would be the wrong one. The process took most of the day. By afternoon, the technicians had collected samples from 17 locations along the strip, including 4 that went significantly deeper than the standard survey depth. They were courteous and professional and gave nothing away. When they left, they took the samples with them and said the initial analysis would take 2 to 3 weeks. Cecilia drove home in the early evening light, watching the windbreak recede in her rearview mirror, its cottonwoods enormous and still against the pale sky. She had no idea what the analysis would show. She had spent money she needed on a question that might return nothing more than confirmation of what her siblings had always assumed. She told herself she was prepared for that outcome. She drove the long way home through the flat fields and did not entirely believe herself. The call came not in 3 weeks, but in 11 days. The technician who called was not the younger woman from the survey, but someone senior, a voice she did not recognize, measured and careful in the way that people are when they are choosing their words with unusual attention. He said he wanted to confirm some details about the location and ownership of the property before proceeding. He asked whether she was the sole owner of the land parcel in question. She said yes. He asked whether she had authorized the survey on behalf of any other parties. She said no. Then he said, and his voice carried the particular steadiness of someone delivering information they know will not land lightly, that the preliminary results were significant and that she should probably sit down. She was already sitting. She did not tell him that. He spoke for several minutes, using technical language that she understood better than he might have expected, given her years in agricultural logistics. Core samples from the deeper test sites had returned results that warranted full analysis, he said. The geological formation beneath the windbreak strip was consistent with a specific type of substrate that occurred rarely in the valley, but had been documented before in adjacent counties. What made the current situation unusual was the extent of it. The formation appeared to run the full length of the strip and extended to a depth that the preliminary cores had not fully characterized. Full analysis would require additional work, but the initial readings were— He paused briefly. He was not overstating when he said this. He wanted her to understand he was being precise. The initial readings were exceptional. Cecilia held the phone very still. Outside her apartment window, a car passed on the street below. She heard it distinctly, the way you hear ordinary things during moments that are not ordinary. She asked him what exceptional meant in concrete terms. He said he would prefer to wait for full analysis before making specific statements. She said she understood that, and then she asked again. He paused. Then he said that if the full analysis confirmed what the preliminary cores suggested, they would be looking at a mineral deposit of significant commercial value. She asked what mineral. He said several, actually, but the most significant readings were for rare earth elements and a specific category of phosphate mineral that had industrial applications in sectors she probably knew: battery technology, electronics manufacturing, and specialized agricultural compounds. She wrote none of it down. She did not need to. The words arranged themselves in her memory with the particular permanence of things you will never forget, no matter how many years pass. She thanked him. She said she looked forward to the full report. She ended the call and set the phone on the table in front of her and sat in her apartment in the late evening quiet and let the information settle into her like water into dry ground. Her father had planted those trees to protect his fields from the wind. He had planted them along the western edge of his land, without ceremony, without expectation, beyond the practical shelter they would provide. He had lived his entire life on that farm, and had never, she was certain of this, had never known what lay beneath the roots of those trees. Had never known that the strip of land he had given his youngest daughter, the land he had dismissed without quite meaning to, the land everyone had agreed was the least valuable thing on the property, rested above something extraordinary. She sat with that knowledge for a long time before she told anyone anything at all. The full analysis took 6 more weeks. Cecilia went about her life during that time with a discipline that surprised even her. She worked her regular job. She called her siblings on the schedule she always called them. She did not visit the Windbreak, not because she was afraid of what she might feel there, but because she understood, with a clarity she had not expected, that the time for walking among those trees in uncertainty was over. The next time she went there, she wanted to know exactly what she was standing above. She did not tell her co-workers. She did not tell the older woman who had asked if she was all right. She did not tell her siblings, and the effort that required surprised her. She had never been a secretive person. Secrecy had never suited her particular kind of honesty. But she understood, without anyone having to explain it to her, that information this significant needed to be fully confirmed before it was shared. A preliminary reading was not a discovery. An analysis was not a guarantee. The Windbreak was still, legally and practically, just a strip of old trees until someone put a number on what lay beneath it. She researched in the evenings, reading everything she could find about rare earth element deposits, about the geology of her region, about the regulatory and commercial framework that governed mineral rights in her state. She learned that mineral rights on agricultural land could be complex, that ownership of surface land did not always include ownership of what lay beneath it, that there were cases where subsurface rights had been separated from surface ownership through historical transactions she might not even know about. This possibility kept her awake on more than one night. She retained a lawyer, paying for an initial consultation out of the same account she had depleted for the survey, and the lawyer spent 2 hours reviewing the deed history of the Windbreak parcel. What the lawyer found was, under the circumstances, the best possible outcome. The Drummond family had owned the land outright for 3 generations. The original deed, filed by her grandfather, had conveyed surface and subsurface rights together, and no subsequent transaction had separated them. When her father's estate had transferred the Windbreak to Cecilia, it had transferred everything: the trees, the roots, the soil, and whatever lay beneath the soil to whatever depth was hers. She paid the lawyer and drove home and let herself feel something she had not allowed herself to feel in months. Not victory, because there was nothing yet to be victorious about. Not vindication, because the process was not yet complete. Just a quiet, specific kind of relief. The relief of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has just, carefully, exhaled. The full analysis report arrived on a Thursday morning. It was 47 pages long, dense with technical language and geological notation, and tables of elemental readings taken at varying depths from the 17 sample sites. She read it twice before she called the survey company to discuss it, and she read it a third time after the call, this time more slowly, letting each section settle before moving to the next. The formation was real, not preliminary, not tentative, not subject to significant revision. Real. The rare earth elements ran through the full length of the strip, concentrated most heavily in the central section where the oldest cottonwood stood. The phosphate minerals extended even deeper, their concentration increasing with depth in a pattern that the report described as unusually consistent. There were smaller concentrations of several other minerals worth noting, including trace amounts of things whose industrial applications Cecilia had spent her evening research hours learning about. The report included a preliminary valuation range, not a precise figure, the authors were careful to note, as precise figures required additional extraction feasibility analysis, regulatory review, and market condition assessment. A range, a preliminary range, subject to revision in either direction depending on additional work. The lower end of that range was $90 million. The upper end was $317 million. Cecilia read that section 4 times. She read it in the kitchen of her apartment with morning light coming through the window and a cup of coffee sitting untouched at her elbow. She read it as a person who had spent her career in logistics and understood what numbers meant. And she read it as the youngest daughter of a farmer who had given her the strip of trees no one wanted because he had never thought to ask what the trees were standing on. She put the report down on the table and looked out the window at the ordinary morning. A neighbor was walking a dog on the street below. A truck was making a delivery to the building across the way. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of a school bus. She did not call Raymond. She did not call Darlene. She did not call Paul in the city, or Vivian, or the older woman at work, or anyone at all. She picked up the cup of coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway, and sat with the number for a long time, letting it become real. The windbreak had always protected the farm. She had known that since she was a child. She just had not known, and none of them had known, that it had been protecting something else as well, something far older and far more patient than any of them, something that had been waiting beneath those roots for longer than her family had owned the land, longer perhaps than anyone had thought to ask what the ground might hold. She called the survey company back on Friday morning and asked about next steps. They connected her with a consulting group that specialized in resource extraction feasibility. She scheduled a call for the following week. Then she called her lawyer and scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss the implications of the report for her ownership rights and what she needed to do to protect herself before the situation became more complicated. Because she knew, with a certainty she did not question, that it would become more complicated. She knew her family. She knew what they would say when they found out. She could already hear Raymond's voice, measured and reasonable and wrong in the particular way that confident people are wrong when they have decided that their version of events is simply true. She could see Darlene's expression, the rapid calculation behind the eyes, the almost immediate pivot from dismissal to interest. She could imagine Paul and Vivian on the phone, their careful, city-polished concern, their equally rapid understanding of what the numbers meant for them. She had one advantage, and that advantage was time. And she intended to use every hour of it. Over the following 3 weeks, Cecilia built what she thought of privately as her foundation. Not a legal strategy, not yet, because the lawyers needed more information before they could advise her properly. Not a public announcement, because nothing was ready for that. Just a foundation. The kind you lay before you build anything else. The kind no one sees, but that everything afterward depends on. She assembled documentation, the survey report, the geological analysis, the deed history provided by her lawyer, correspondence with the survey company and the consulting group. She organized it in a binder and in a digital file backed up to 3 separate locations. She was not naturally a paranoid person, but she had worked in logistics long enough to understand that important things needed redundancy. She met with the consulting group on a video call that lasted nearly 2 hours. They were thorough, professional, and transparent about the complexity of what she was facing. A deposit of this type and scale would require environmental impact assessment, state and federal permitting, negotiation with extraction companies, and a detailed feasibility study before any commercial operation could begin. The timeline from current state to first revenue was measured in years, not months. The process was real, but it was not fast. She asked them what the most important thing she could do right now was. They said, "Protect your rights. Make sure no one can challenge your ownership of the subsurface, and make sure you understand exactly what you own before you begin any conversation with any outside party." She wrote that down. She already understood it, but writing it down made it concrete. Her lawyer was preparing a comprehensive title review and a formal legal opinion on the scope of her subsurface rights. The process was moving. It was moving quietly and carefully, and without anyone else in her family knowing it was moving at all. And that was exactly how she needed it to stay, at least for a little while longer. She visited the Windbreak for the first time since the survey on a Sunday in early spring, when the cottonwoods were just beginning to bud, their enormous trunks dark with recent rain, the air carrying the particular clean smell of wet earth and new growth. She parked where she always parked, on the gravel track alongside the trees, and walked north to south the way she always walked. Slowly, hands in her jacket pockets, the ground soft beneath her feet. She stood for a long time near the central cluster of the oldest trees, the ones the survey had identified as sitting directly above the highest concentration of the deposit. She looked up at the branches, already beginning to fill with new leaves, at the way the sky showed through the canopy in shifting patches of gray and pale blue. The roots around her feet were massive, dark, intricate. They had been growing here for decades, slowly, patiently, not knowing what they grew above. She thought about her father. She thought about the morning he had told her, in passing, years ago, that he had planted the windbreak himself when he was a young man, that it had been one of the first things he had done on the farm that was truly his own, that he had chosen the cottonwoods specifically because they were hardy and deep-rooted and would hold the soil even in bad years. She thought about that word, deep-rooted, and what it had meant to him and what it meant now. And she felt something she could not name precisely, something that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but contained both. She had not chosen the windbreak. It had been given to her as a consolation, as the remainder, after everything worth keeping, had been divided among people who were considered more important. But she had come to it honestly, the way she had come to everything in her life, with her hands open and her attention steady, asking nothing except the chance to understand it better. And the windbreak had answered. She walked back to her car as the afternoon light began to shift toward evening. The cottonwoods stood behind her, enormous and still, their roots reaching downward into the dark geology of the plain, their branches reaching upward into the early spring sky. She had inherited the edge of her father's farm, the part no one wanted, the part that existed, everyone had agreed, only to protect everything else. She started the car and pulled onto the gravel track and drove back toward the main road. Behind her, the windbreak held its position on the western edge of the Drummond farm, as it had always held it, patient and unannounced, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question about what it was standing on. There was a moment, driving home that evening, when she almost called Raymond. The urge came without warning, rising up in her chest with the particular force of old habit. She and Raymond had not been close in the way siblings who shared a childhood sometimes became close, but they had been in each other's lives for their entire existence, and the instinct to share important news with family was deeply wired in her. Her hand moved toward the phone on the seat beside her. She let it rest there without picking it up. The urge passed. She drove on. What stopped her was not calculation, or not only calculation. It was something quieter, a recognition that the moment she shared the information, she would no longer be the only person who held it, and that shift in custody would change everything. Raymond was not a malicious person. He had not given her the windbreak out of cruelty. He had given it to her because, in his understanding of the world and of his family, it had seemed like the fair thing to do, the reasonable outcome of an honest division. He had been wrong, and not for the first time in his life had he been confidently wrong in a way that happened to benefit him. But calling him now, in the first flush of having numbers that dwarfed everything he had inherited, would not be a conversation. It would be a confrontation. And Cecilia had learned long ago that confrontations entered too soon rarely ended well. She would need, she understood, to be patient for a little while longer. Patience was not something she had to work at. It was something the farm had taught her before she could read, something the windbreak had reinforced every single time she had walked among those trees without yet knowing what they stood above. The cottonwoods had been patient for decades. She could manage another few weeks. The legal opinion came from her lawyer on a Tuesday. There were 12 pages that confirmed in formal language what the deed review had already suggested. Her ownership of the Windbreak parcel included full subsurface rights to unlimited depth. No historical severance, no prior claim, no competing interest had been filed or registered against the parcel in 3 generations of Drummond ownership. The opinion noted, with the measured language of legal documents, that the rights were sole and exclusive, and that any commercial development of subsurface resources would be at the owner's sole discretion. She read it at her kitchen table in the early morning before work, still in the clothes she had slept in, coffee growing cold at her elbow, the way it always did when she was reading something that required her full attention. Sole and exclusive. She said the words aloud quietly, to no one, in the empty kitchen. The sound of them was strange and solid and entirely real. At work that day, she moved through her tasks with the particular calm of someone who is carrying something heavy, but has found the right way to hold it. She processed invoices, managed a supplier dispute that had been simmering for 2 weeks, took a call from a distribution manager in another county who needed help coordinating a delivery schedule. She was competent and focused and present in the way she always was, and no one who looked at her would have guessed that the ground beneath her particular life had shifted irrevocably. The older woman, whose name was Phyllis, and who had been working in agricultural logistics for nearly 30 years, stopped by Cecilia's desk in the mid-afternoon and put a hand briefly on her shoulder without saying anything. It was a small gesture, one Phyllis made occasionally when she could see that something was being carried quietly. Cecilia looked up, and Phyllis gave her a nod, the kind that meant, "I see you, and I am not going to ask you to explain." Cecilia nodded back. They returned to their respective work. In the evenings, she had begun teaching herself more about the extraction industry, not because she planned to run a mining operation herself, obviously, but because she had learned through years of logistics work that ignorance in any negotiation was the most expensive thing you could bring to the table. She read about licensing structures and royalty agreements, about the difference between selling mineral rights outright and entering into extraction contracts that would pay ongoing royalties based on production volume. She read about companies that specialized in rare earth element recovery, their financial structures, their histories, the terms they had negotiated with other landowners in similar situations. She read about those other landowners particularly carefully. Some of them had sold their rights for large single sums that had seemed extraordinary at the time, and had proven, over subsequent years, to be far less than the ongoing royalties would have yielded. Others had retained their rights and collected payments for decades, their initial agreement compounding into generational wealth. The distinction she read in one analysis written by a researcher at a land economics institute came down almost entirely to whether the landowner had had competent, specialized legal and financial representation at the time of negotiation. Those who had, did well. Those who had relied on general advisors, or worse, on the extraction company's own counsel, did less well, sometimes dramatically less well. She called her lawyer again and asked who she should be talking to about this. Her lawyer, to his credit, was honest with her. He said that his expertise was in property law, and that what she was describing had grown beyond his wheelhouse. He gave her 3 names, specialists in mineral and resource rights, people who had represented landowners in similar negotiations. He noted that one of them, a woman in the state capital, had a particular reputation in rare earth element cases. He said that reputation had been earned. Cecilia called that woman the next morning. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, she had an appointment scheduled for the following week and a clearer sense of what the next several months would look like than she had managed to construct through all her solo research. The specialist was direct in the way that experts are when they have seen enough to know that soft pedaling does not help anyone. She said the situation was genuinely significant. She said the protections Cecilia had already put in place, the deed review, the legal opinion, the careful documentation, were exactly right. She said that from here, the process would be methodical and not fast, but that she had worked with worse starting positions and seen better outcomes. And she said she did not expect Cecilia to have any trouble defending what was hers. What was hers? Cecilia said goodbye, set the phone down, and sat with that phrase for a moment. The windbreak had been hers from the day her father's will was read. It had been hers in every legal and practical sense. But for months, hers had felt like a consolation, like the word you used to describe something you had been given because it was what remained after everything else was taken. Now, for the first time, hers felt like what it actually was, a foundation, the start of something she was only beginning to understand. She went to bed that night and lay awake in the comfortable dark of her apartment and thought about her father. She thought about the way he had looked at the windbreak when she was a child, the quick, functional assessment of a farmer, checking that his wind protection was doing its job. She thought about the morning he had walked her along the length of it when she was perhaps 7 years old, pointing out the biggest trees, explaining why he had spaced them the way he had, explaining the way wind moved across flat land, and what happened when it met resistance. He had not been teaching her anything in particular. He had simply been talking the way people talk, when they are somewhere they know well and have someone beside them who is willing to listen. She had listened. She had always listened. It was perhaps the thing she did best in the world, the skill that her siblings had never particularly valued because it was quiet and produced nothing visible. But it was what had brought her back to the windbreak again and again after the funeral. It was what had made her look carefully at the soil instead of dismissing what she saw. It was what had prompted the survey and the analysis and everything that followed. And she had listened to the windbreak the way she had listened to her father, patiently, without agenda, willing to be surprised. The windbreak had rewarded that attention in a way that exceeded anything she could have anticipated or deserved. She understood that the reward was not purely the result of her own effort. The deposit had existed long before she was born. Her ownership of it was partly the outcome of her father's casual decision to give her the trees no one wanted. The geology did not care about justice. The rare earth elements did not know they were buried beneath the inheritance of the overlooked daughter. But she had looked, and looking had made all the difference. She started the car and pulled onto the gravel track and drove back toward the main road. Behind her, the windbreak held its position on the western edge of the Drummond farm, as it had always held it, patient and unannounced, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question about what it was standing on. The right question had been asked. The answer was coming. And the next chapter of Cecilia Drummond's life was about to begin in a way that no one, least of all the people who had dismissed her, was remotely prepared for. In the days following the autumn visit to the Windbreak, Cecilia began doing something she had not permitted herself to do before. She began to plan. Not the careful, guarded planning she had done during the preceding months. The defensive architecture of someone protecting what they had before they were sure they had it. Real planning. The kind where you imagine the shape of a future that is genuinely different from the present, and you let that future feel possible enough to inhabit in advance. She made lists. They were not dramatic lists. They did not contain entries like buy mansion or travel the world or any of the things that people imagine they would do when asked to fantasize about sudden wealth. Her lists were quieter than that and more specific because she was a quiet and specific person, and that was not going to change because of what lay beneath a stand of cottonwood trees in the Western Valley. The parcel she had been looking at, 2 miles from the farm, went on the list. She called the realtor and arranged a second viewing, this time walking the ground more carefully, checking the drainage patterns, assessing the barn's structural condition, and standing at the kitchen window to confirm that yes, on a clear morning, you could see the tops of the cottonwoods on the western edge of the Drummond farm from exactly that angle. She put down a good faith deposit from her own savings that same afternoon. The price was manageable. The place was right. She did not require anyone's permission to decide that. She also made a call she had been considering for several weeks to a small agricultural education organization in the next county that worked with young women from farming families who wanted to pursue careers in land science, soil management, and resource development. She had come across the organization during her evening research and had bookmarked it with the vague intention of doing something with it someday. Someday had arrived. She called them and asked what they needed most. The answer, as it usually was with such organizations, was money, but also mentorship from people who had actually navigated the technical and legal landscape of resource management. She said she might be able to help with both. She left her number and said she would be in touch when her own situation was more resolved. Margaret updated her the first week of October. The primary extraction company had moved to the next phase of negotiation, submitting a revised royalty proposal that addressed several of the terms Margaret had pushed back on. The regulatory timeline was proceeding on schedule. The environmental impact assessment was underway, conducted by a firm Margaret trusted. There were no unexpected obstacles. The process was the process, and the process was moving. Margaret said, and she said it with the measured optimism of someone who had learned not to promise outcomes she could not guarantee, that she expected the core terms of an agreement to be in place within 4 to 6 months. She said the structure she was pursuing would position Cecilia to receive a meaningful upfront payment upon signing, followed by royalty income beginning approximately 18 months after extraction operations commenced, and continuing for the projected life of the deposit, which the appraisal had conservatively estimated at 50 years. 50 years of royalty income. Cecilia did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way she had always done arithmetic, automatically, because numbers had always been her first language before words. She did not share the result with Margaret. They both knew what the arithmetic produced. She told Phyllis the full story on a Friday afternoon in the break room at the agricultural supplier, sitting at the small table by the window with the last of the day's light coming in and coffee going cold between them. She told it from the beginning. The funeral, the will reading, the walks among the trees, the trowel in the soil, the professor, the survey team, the technician's pause, the phone call, the report, the number. Phyllis listened without interrupting. She was good at that. When Cecilia finished, Phyllis was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that she had always known Cecilia saw things other people missed. She said it with the authority of someone who had been watching for 30 years. She said she just hadn't known it was going to be worth $300 million. Cecilia laughed. It was the first time she had laughed about any of this. A real laugh, unguarded and complete, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and releases something that has been held in for a long time. Phyllis smiled the smile of someone who has been waiting for that exact sound. She told Phyllis about the agricultural education organization she had called. She told her about the parcel she had put a deposit on. She told her she was thinking about setting up a small foundation in her father's name, not to rehabilitate his memory or to perform generosity, but because the Windbreak had been part of his land and the wealth it contained had grown from ground he had cared for. And she thought that connection deserved acknowledgement, even if he had not been aware of it. Phyllis said that was exactly the kind of thing a good person would think to do. She said it simply, and Cecilia received it simply, and they finished their coffee in the companionable quiet of two people who have known each other long enough that silence between them means something good. The autumn deepened. The cottonwoods went fully gold, then copper, then let go of their leaves in the slow, deliberate way of old trees that have performed this ritual too many times to be rushed. Cecilia drove past the Windbreak on her way to the new parcel one morning and watched the bare branches against the pale October sky and thought about her grandfather planting those trees when they were saplings, small and tentative, nothing like the enormous presences they had become. He had planted them to hold the soil and stop the wind. He had succeeded at both. But the roots he had sent downward, the deep, complex root systems of the cottonwoods he had chosen for their hardiness, had done something he had never planned for. They had grown into the extraordinary geology of the valley floor, had intertwined with formations that carried within them the concentrated product of geological processes far older than any human ambition, and had held that ground, steady for decades, while the world above remained unaware of what lay below. Her grandfather had been a patient man. She had heard that from her father more than once. A man who planted trees he would not live to see at their full size, who prepared ground for harvests he might not be alive to bring in, who believed that doing the right work in the right way was its own justification regardless of who benefited or when. She did not know if he would have approved of her specifically, but she thought he would have recognized the quality of attention she had brought to his trees, and she thought, if he had known what was beneath them, he would have been glad it was her who found it. She spent a morning at the new parcel in late October, walking the boundaries the way her father had taught her to walk boundaries, slowly, with attention to everything, including the things that seemed irrelevant. The soil here was different from the Windbreak, shallower, less complex, more typical of the valley floor in this section. She did not survey it. She was not looking for anything. She was simply learning the ground, the way you learn any new place you intend to make your own. She stood at the edge of the small creek that ran along the southern boundary and watched the water move in the flat, the clear way it moved in autumn when the snowmelt was months away. The sound it made was the sound of water doing its ordinary, essential, unwitnessed work. She had always loved that sound. She intended to hear it most mornings for the rest of her life. In the evenings that autumn, she began writing things down. Not a formal account, not a story for anyone else, but notes to herself about the preceding months, the decisions she had made and why, the moments when she had been afraid, and the ways she had managed the fear, the things she had learned about mineral rights and geological surveys and extraction negotiations that she had not known the year before. She wrote about the morning walks. She wrote about the technician's pause. She wrote about sitting in her kitchen reading a valuation report and hearing a school bus somewhere in the distance. She wrote about what it felt like to be seen. Finally, after a lifetime of being assessed and found to be worth less than the people around her had decided to take. She did not write about it with bitterness. She wrote about it with the particular clarity that comes when you have been in the dark long enough that you have learned to see in it. And then the light comes, and you understand both the dark and the light with a precision you could not have had if you had simply been in the light all along. She was the daughter who got the trees. She had always been the daughter who got the trees. And the trees, it turned out, Sean had been standing above something that no one else had been patient enough, or curious enough, or stubborn enough to find. She put the cap on her pen and closed the notebook, and looked out the window at the last of the October light on the fields. Tomorrow there were calls to make and documents to review and work to do. The ordinary, careful, non-glamorous work of someone building something that will last. She was glad of it. She had always been good at work. It was, in the end, what she had. It was, in the end, everything. The specialist's name was Margaret Okafor, and she had the quality that the best professionals carry without effort, the ability to make complicated things feel manageable without pretending they were simple. She had been working in mineral and resource rights law for 22 years, and when she sat across from Cecilia at the conference table in her office on a Wednesday morning in late April, she had already read the full geological report twice and had placed a number of calls to people whose names she did not share, but whose opinions she trusted. She confirmed everything the report had stated and added several things it had not. The rare earth element concentrations, she said, were among the highest documented in privately held land in the region. Not the highest ever recorded anywhere. She was not going to overstate things, because overstating things at this stage led to poor decisions later, but genuinely significant by any reasonable standard of comparison. The phosphate deposit that ran beneath the deeper sections of the strip had industrial applications that were currently attracting considerable commercial attention, given the expansion of battery manufacturing operations across the country. The timing, she said carefully, was not irrelevant. She laid out 3 possible paths. The first was outright sale of the mineral rights, a single transaction that would produce a large, immediate sum and remove ongoing responsibility. The second was a royalty agreement with an extraction company, a smaller upfront payment in exchange for ongoing percentage payments based on production volume over the life of the deposit, which geologists estimated at 40 to 60 years. The third was a hybrid arrangement, partial rights sale combined with retained royalties on specific mineral categories, on a more complex structure that required more sophisticated management, but that had historically produced the best long-term outcomes for landowners in comparable situations. Cecilia listened to all 3 options without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she asked 3 questions. The first was about the realistic timeline for each option. The second was about the tax implications. The third was about what other landowners in similar situations had typically chosen when they had the benefit of good counsel, and what they had typically wished they had chosen when they looked back 10 years later. Margaret looked at her for a moment before answering. It was the kind of look that meant she was recalibrating something. Then she answered all 3 questions thoroughly and honestly. She drove home from that meeting through the flat, a familiar landscape of the valley, the fields on either side of the road already deep green with early season growth, the sky wide and pale above them. She thought about her father driving this same road in the truck she had learned to shift gears in when she was 12 years old. She thought about what he would have made of all this. She believed he would have been astonished. She also believed he would have been proud, not in a way that changed anything about the inheritance or made the old wound less real, but in the quiet, particular way a farmer feels when the land produces something unexpected. She was not angry at her father. She had examined that feeling carefully over the preceding months, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lies beneath it, and what she found was not anger, but something more complicated. Some sorrow, perhaps, at the missed connection. The recognition that he had looked at her and seen someone worth less than what she was, not because he was a cruel man, but because he had never thought to look more carefully, the same way he had never thought to ask what lay beneath the windbreak. Both errors had come from the same place: assumption, the comfortable shorthand of a man who thought he already understood what things were worth. She had not inherited his assumptions. That, she thought, driving home through the green valley, was perhaps the most important thing she had inherited from him at all. The formal appraisal process began in May, conducted by an independent geological firm retained jointly by Cecilia's legal team and a prospective extraction company that Margaret had identified as a credible and well-capitalized partner. The firm sent a team of 4 geologists and 2 engineers who spent 3 days on the windbreak strip with equipment that dwarfed the survey team's tools in size and sophistication. Cecilia was present for all 3 days. She did not hover or interfere. She watched from a respectful distance, asked questions when she had them, and took notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. The lead geologist, a compact man in his 60s, named Dr. Alvarez, who had spent most of his career in field work, noticed her attention on the second day and began offering explanations without being asked. He pointed out the specific formations visible in the core samples they were pulling, explaining what the colors and textures indicated, what the density readings meant, how the elemental concentrations at different depths told the story of the deposit's geological history. She listened the way she always listened, completely and without performance. By the end of the second day, Dr. Alvarez was talking to her the way he talked to his colleagues, in technical shorthand that assumed knowledge she had acquired over weeks of evening research, and she was following him without difficulty. On the third day, he showed her a core sample from the deepest extraction point and said, without fanfare, that it was one of the cleaner rare earth specimens he had pulled from a field site in 12 years. He said it the way someone says something when they want it to be recorded in someone else's memory. She recorded it. The formal appraisal report was delivered 4 weeks later, so it ran to 61 pages and had been prepared with the kind of rigor that would hold up to commercial scrutiny. The document confirmed the deposit in terms that left no meaningful room for dispute. The rare earth elements, primarily neodymium, dysprosium, and lanthanum, were present at concentrations that exceeded the economic threshold for extraction by a significant margin. The phosphate deposit ran to a depth of approximately 300 meters in the central section and was estimated to contain recoverable reserves sufficient to sustain commercial operation for at least 50 years at standard extraction rates. The formal valuation, based on current market prices for the relevant minerals, estimated extraction costs, and projected royalty income over the deposit's commercial life, produced a figure that was precise rather than a range. The number was $243 million in projected lifetime royalty income under a standard extraction agreement, with an alternative outright sale value of the mineral rights estimated at between $160 and $180 million, depending on market conditions at the time of transaction. Cecilia received the report on a Friday afternoon. She read it at her kitchen table, as she had read the preliminary analysis, as she had read everything connected to this process, carefully, completely, from first page to last. She took notes in the margins. When she reached the valuation section, she stopped and read it 3 more times, not because she did not understand it, but because understanding and believing are different things. And she was making sure she had fully crossed from the first to the second. The windbreak strip her father had given her, the 12 acres of old trees that her siblings had assessed as worth practically nothing, had a formal, documented, appraisal-supported value of between $160 and $243 million, depending on the structure of the deal she chose. She closed the report. She set it on the table beside her notepad and her pen and the cold remnants of the coffee she had made 2 hours ago. She sat very still for a long moment, Then she picked up her phone and called Phyllis. She did not tell Phyllis everything. She had promised herself she would not tell anyone everything. Not yet. Not until the legal protections were fully in place. But she told Phyllis enough. She said that something had come through on the Windbreak property. She said it was significant. She said she had been sitting on it for months because she needed to be sure, and she was sure now. She said she was better than all right, and her voice, when she said it, had something in it that Phyllis had not heard before, something steady and warm and unguarded. Phyllis was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Good." Just that one word. Good. And the way she said it contained everything a person can put into a single word when they mean it completely. She told Raymond on a Tuesday evening in June, 3 weeks after receiving the formal appraisal, and 2 weeks after Margaret had filed the necessary protective documents with the county recorder's office, ensuring that Cecilia's ownership of the subsurface rights was publicly registered and legally unassailable before any conversation with her family took place. She drove to the farmhouse on a weekday evening, choosing a time when Darlene was unlikely to be there, when the post-work quiet would make the conversation more manageable. Raymond was on the back porch when she arrived, sitting in the same chair their father had always used, looking out over the fields in the long evening light. He had a glass of iced tea on the arm of the chair and the particular stillness of a man who has finished his work for the day and is satisfied with it. He turned when he heard her footsteps and raised a hand in greeting. He was genuinely glad to see her. Whatever else Raymond was, he was not someone who harbored active ill will toward his family, and his welcome was real. She sat in the chair beside him, and they talked for a while about ordinary things, the season, the equipment, a fence on the east parcel that needed attention. She let the conversation find its own level before she said what she had come to say. When she told him, she did it plainly. She said she had had the Windbreak surveyed and appraised. She said the results had come back formally, and that she had had the findings reviewed by legal and technical specialists. She said the parcel contained a mineral deposit that had been appraised at a value of between $160 and $243 million. She said her subsurface rights to the deposit had been legally registered and were not subject to challenge. She said she wanted him to hear it from her rather than from someone else. The silence that followed was one of the longest she had ever shared with her brother. He did not move. His face went through several things in quick succession. Disbelief first, then calculation, then something harder to name, something that lived in the neighborhood of shame without quite being shame, the recognition that he had been wrong in a way that could not be reframed or minimized. He asked several questions. They were not unreasonable questions. He asked how certain the appraisal was. He asked whether the mineral rights had been clearly established as hers. He asked whether there were any complications with the extraction process that might affect the value. She answered all of them. She had anticipated all of them. She answered without anger and without triumph, because she had decided months ago that she was not going to make this moment about winning. It was not about winning. It was about being seen, finally, clearly, for what she was and what she had. Raymond was quiet for a long time after her answers. The evening light moved across the fields in front of them. When he finally spoke, he said he was glad she had come to tell him herself. He said it awkwardly, the way people say things, when they are trying to say more than the words they have available. She nodded. She understood what he meant. He did not apologize. She had not expected an apology. What she received was the particular quiet that comes when a person acknowledges, without quite saying so, that they got something wrong. Darlene found out the following day. The call came in the morning, earlier than she expected. Darlene's voice carrying the brisk efficiency she used when she was managing something she had not anticipated. She asked several sharp, precise questions about the legal structure of the mineral rights. She asked about the appraisal firm's credentials. She asked, and this was the question Cecilia had most expected, whether there was any basis for a claim on behalf of the other siblings, given that the Windbreak had been part of the broader Drummond estate. Cecilia said she had had that question specifically reviewed by her legal team. She said the answer was unambiguous. The Windbreak and its subsurface rights had been conveyed to her solely and completely under the terms of their father's will. There was no legal basis for a competing claim. She said it without heat. She said it the way you state a documented fact. So Darlene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that had shed most of its briskness, that she supposed Cecilia had been paying more attention than any of them had realized. Paul and Vivian called within 24 hours of each other. Both conversations followed similar patterns: initial surprise, rapid comprehension of what the numbers meant, careful questions about legal standing, and then a quality of silence in which Cecilia could almost hear the recalibration happening in real time. Paul said he was happy for her, and he sounded like he mostly meant it. Vivian said she had always believed the Windbreak was special, and the claim was so transparently untrue that Cecilia almost laughed, not unkindly, but with the affectionate exasperation of someone who knows their family well enough to recognize its particular brand of revisionism. She did not hold any of it against them. She had spent months preparing herself not to hold it against them, because she understood that resentment in this situation would only diminish what she had. They had not deliberately wronged her. They had assessed the Windbreak with the eyes they had, using the assumptions they carried, and they had been wrong. That wrongness had consequences, and those consequences were now woven into the fabric of all of their lives in ways that could not be undone. But she had not built her future on their failure. She had built it on her own attention, her own patience, her own willingness to look carefully at something everyone else had dismissed. The news traveled through the county, the way news always traveled through small communities, faster than anyone expected, and with a particular energy that transformed the story as it moved. The initial facts were accurate enough. Cecilia Drummond, youngest daughter of Elias Drummond, had discovered a mineral deposit on the Windbreak parcel she had inherited. The deposit was worth a very large sum of money. The range of figures cited all had the same number of digits, and that was what people remembered. The reactions were not uniform. Some people were genuinely pleased for her, the uncomplicated pleasure that comes when someone you have known all your life has something good happen to them that they clearly deserved. Others were more complicated in their responses, not hostile exactly, but carrying the particular discomfort of people who had said the wrong thing at the wrong time and now had to live with having said it. The co-worker who had mentioned Cecilia's inheritance in earshot of Cecilia herself, describing it as just the trees, came by her desk one morning and stood there awkwardly for a moment before saying something inadequate and moving away. Cecilia let it pass without comment. She did not need the acknowledgement. She had what she needed. In the county more broadly, the story became something people told to illustrate things, not always accurately, not always fairly, but with a consistency that suggested it had struck something real. It was told as a story about overlooked value, about the danger of assuming you know what something is worth before you have looked carefully. It's about the things that persist in the ground, beneath the places where we have always lived, patient and unannounced, waiting for someone with the right kind of attention to find them. Raymond, in the weeks that followed, did something Cecilia had not expected. He began asking questions, not about the deposit or the money, but about the survey process, about how she had known to look, about what had prompted her to spend money she did not have on an investigation that everyone else would have considered pointless. He asked in the careful way of someone who is trying to learn something rather than to argue about it. She answered honestly, describing the morning walks, the unusual soil, the particular way the ground felt different underfoot, the instinct that had brought her back again and again before she had any evidence to support it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had walked past that windbreak 1,000 times in his life and never looked at it. He said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of something true. She did not contradict him. It was true. Margaret was moving the commercial negotiations forward at the pace she had described, methodical and not fast. The extraction company had submitted a formal letter of intent. The regulatory process was underway. The timeline she had outlined in their first meeting had proven accurate, measured in years rather than months, and Cecilia had accepted that without impatience. She had waited this long to be seen. She could wait a little longer to be paid. What she could not wait for, and what she began to act on before any commercial agreement was signed, was the conversation she needed to have with herself about what she intended to do with what was coming. The money itself was not the thing that occupied her most. She had grown up on a farm. She had spent her adult life in a modest apartment making a modest salary, and she knew, with the clarity that comes from long acquaintance, that the thing about enough was that enough was all you needed, and that more than enough only mattered if you knew what you were going to do with it. She wanted to stay on the land. That was the first and most certain thing. Not in the farmhouse, which was Raymond's now, but near the farm, near the fields she had grown up in, near the windbreak that had given her everything. So she had already begun looking at a small parcel 2 miles from the western edge of her father's land, a piece of ground with a modest house and a barn in reasonable condition, situated so that on clear mornings she could see the tops of the cottonwoods from the kitchen window. She wanted to set something aside for the next generation. Her grandfather had planted those trees with his hands, without knowing what he was planting above, and 3 generations had benefited from his work without ever thanking him for it. She intended to do something for people she had not yet met, in a form she had not yet decided, because that was the kind of continuity she believed in. On a September evening, when the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn, their leaves shifting from deep summer green toward the early gold that preceded the full autumn display, she drove out to the windbreak alone and parked on the gravel track. She walked north from the parking spot to the central cluster, moving slowly, her hands in her pockets, the air carrying the dry, clear smell of early autumn in the valley. The trees looked the same as they always had, enormous, patient, indifferent to everything that had happened in the months since she had first begun walking among them with the particular attention of someone who suspects they are not seeing everything there is to see. Their roots reached downward into the dark geology of the plain, as they always had. The deposit below them was unchanged by the months of human activity above. It was simply there, as it had always been, as it would have been whether or not anyone ever found it. She thought about that, about the things that exist without being found, the deposits of value, mineral and otherwise, that lie beneath the surfaces of ordinary places and wait without urgency for someone to stop and look. She thought about how many such places there might be in the world, how many ordinary patches of ground concealed something extraordinary, how much of what the world dismissed as worthless was only worthless because no one had bothered to ask the right questions. She thought about the people for whom the right questions had never been asked, the overlooked daughters of the world, the ones who had been given the windbreaks while their siblings received the fields, the ones whose attention and patience and love of the land had never been measured in the currency their families understood. She did not know what to do with that thought exactly. It was too large and too old to be resolved in a single evening, standing among cottonwood trees. But she held it for a while, the way you hold things that are too important to put down before you are sure you have understood them. The light was failing when she walked back to the car. The trees stood behind her in the cooling air, their gold leaves catching what remained of the sun and holding it for a moment longer than the rest of the landscape. She looked back at them once before she opened the car door. They had given her everything. She had given them only attention. It seemed, in the scale of things, like a very good trade. She drove home through the turning fields with the windows down, the cool air moving through the car, the flat sky above the valley going from pale gold to deep blue. She was not yet rich. The agreements were not yet signed. The money was still, in the most concrete sense, beneath the ground. But she was no longer the woman who had sat at a kitchen table and been told that her inheritance was the trees no one wanted. She was the woman who had walked out to the edge of her family's land in the gray pre-dawn and looked at what she had been given, really looked at it, with the full weight of her attention, and found that it was extraordinary. She had known something was there. She had not known what. She had gone to find out anyway. That was the whole story, told simply. Everything else was detail. So part 2 of Cecilia Drummond's story was ending here, in the turning autumn, with the legal work underway, and the numbers confirmed, and the family rearranged in their understanding of who she was. What came next? The signed agreements, and the first payments, and the transformation of possibility into reality. That was part 3. That was where the rest of the world would finally see what she had known, standing among her trees in the cold, early morning. For a long time now. She was ready. The first complication arose in August, 5 months into the formal process. A second extraction company, one that Margaret had not been negotiating with, filed a notice of interest with the county recorder's office, citing what their documentation described as a historical right of exploration granted by an agreement signed in the 1970s between a predecessor company and an unspecified landowner in the region. The notice was vague and technically questionable, but it was enough to introduce uncertainty into the timeline and to require Cecilia's legal team to spend several weeks investigating its validity. The investigation concluded that the historical agreement was not applicable to the Drummond Windbreak parcel. The predecessor company had dissolved in the 1990s without transferring its agreements to a successor entity, and the parcel specified in the original agreement did not include the Drummond land. The notice was withdrawn after Margaret's team filed a formal rebuttal. The process cost time and legal fees and produced a week of anxiety that Cecilia managed by doing what she always did when anxiety threatened to become unproductive. She went to work, she took her notes, she kept her documents in order, and she waited. What the complication taught her was something she had already suspected. When significant money was in play, people found reasons to believe they were entitled to it. The notice had not been malicious exactly. It had been opportunistic, the predictable behavior of a company that had seen the filings and decided to test whether there was anything to be gained by introducing doubt. There had not been, but it confirmed that the protections Margaret had put in place were essential, and it confirmed that the methodical approach had been the right one. She mentioned the complication to Raymond during one of their conversations that had become, since the evening on the porch, more regular and more honest than their previous contact. He asked how she had handled it. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then said that it sounded like she had the right people around her. She said she had been careful about that. He said he could tell. There was a quality in his voice when he said it that she had not heard from him before, something that might have been respect. She accepted it without comment. It was enough that it was there. The summer moved forward. The regulatory review progressed. The extraction company Margaret had identified as the primary negotiating partner submitted a revised proposal in September that was, in Margaret's assessment, within the range of what was achievable, though not yet at the best possible terms. The negotiation was in its middle phase, a place where patience and precision mattered more than urgency, and where the discipline to hold your position was worth more than any single concession you might win. Cecilia held her position. She had practice at that. She had been holding her position in various forms, her entire life. There was something she had not anticipated about the weeks that followed the family conversations, something she had not planned for and had not known to expect. It was not the practical consequences she had imagined, the legal skirmishes, the complicated financial dynamics, the adjustment of relationships. Those had all arrived on schedule and been managed. What she had not expected was the quality of the silence that followed all of it, the particular quietness that settled over the Drummond family once the initial wave of revelation had passed and everyone had recalibrated to the new reality. Raymond called her on a weekday afternoon in late summer, not about the deposit or the negotiations, but to ask whether she would want to come to the farm for the weekend. His eldest son was visiting, and he thought it would be good to have the family together. He said it in a careful way that suggested he understood the word family had recently become more complicated, but that he was extending the invitation sincerely regardless. She went. The weekend was not easy, exactly, but it was honest in a way that their family gatherings had not been for a long time, possibly had never been, and she drove home Sunday evening with the feeling of something fractured, beginning, very slowly, to knit. Darlene sent a message 2 weeks later. It was brief and formal in the way that Darlene's communications were always brief and formal, but it contained a sentence toward the end that Cecilia read 3 times. It said that she hoped the process was going smoothly, and that if there was anything Darlene could do on the administrative side, meaning the farm's administrative side, to make the situation easier, she should feel free to ask. It was, translated from Darlene's vocabulary, as close to an offer of help as Darlene had ever extended. Cecilia thanked her and said she would keep it in mind. She meant it. The Agricultural Education Organization called back in September. A woman named Teresa, who ran the program with the kind of focused energy that comes from doing work you believe in without adequate resources, had found Cecilia's number and returned her call. They spoke for 40 minutes. Teresa described the program, its participants, its goals, its funding gaps. She spoke about the young women she worked with, daughters of farming families who wanted to build careers in land and resource science, but who lacked the connections and the capital to access the training they needed. She described them without sentimentality, as individuals with specific skills and specific needs and specific futures that could go very differently depending on what support they received. Cecilia listened carefully. She asked about the program's structure, its existing partnerships, its legal status, what it could do with unrestricted funding versus restricted grants. She asked about the participants who had completed the program and where they had gone. She asked about the wait list. Teresa said there was always a wait list. She said it the way you say something that should not be true, but is, the resigned frustration of someone who has been fighting resource scarcity long enough to have developed a sense of dark humor about it. Cecilia said she thought they should talk again once her own situation was more resolved. She said she was serious about the mentorship and the funding. She said she had spent the last year learning more about geological surveys and mineral rights negotiations than she had ever expected to know, and that some of that knowledge, combined with 30 years of agricultural logistics experience, might be useful to the people Teresa was trying to help. Teresa was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would very much look forward to that conversation. These were the things Cecilia thought about in the evenings that autumn, alongside the legal documents and the financial projections and the methodical, necessary work of securing her future. She thought about who the money was for, beyond herself. She had grown up understanding that land was not only an asset, it was a responsibility, a relationship, something you held in trust for the people who would come after you and for the ground itself, which had its own needs and its own timeline and its own silent requirements. Her grandfather had understood that. Her father had understood it in his own limited way. She intended to understand it more fully. She was not naive about what the money would change. She understood that significant wealth created its own complications, its own responsibilities, its own particular weight. She had watched, over the course of the preceding months, how the prospect of it had already shifted the dynamics of her family, her community, her own inner life. Money did not solve problems. It amplified existing qualities. If you were careful and patient before you had it, you would need to be more careful and more patient after. If you were thoughtful about what things were worth before the numbers changed, you would need to be more thoughtful after. She believed she had the right foundation for what was coming. She had built that foundation the only way she knew how, slowly, with attention, by going back to the same place again and again until she understood it. The windbreak had taught her that. The cottonwoods had demonstrated it. Patient work, deep roots, the willingness to hold the ground even when the wind was bad. She was, in the end, her grandfather's granddaughter. She had planted what she could plant, with the hands and the time and the resources she had, and she had trusted the ground to do the rest. The ground, it turned out, had been generous. The ground always was, when you paid it the right kind of attention. The autumn light stretched long across the valley floor as October moved toward November, turning the fields from green to gold to the pale, harvested brown of a season completing itself. The cottonwoods had begun to stand bare against the gray sky, their enormous forms simplified by the loss of leaves into something almost architectural, the pure structure of their growth visible without ornament. She drove past them on her way to and from the new parcel, which was hers now, papers signed, keys in her pocket, the creek along the southern boundary doing its quiet, essential work. She had not yet moved in. She was waiting until the timing felt right, until the season turned enough that beginning in the new house felt like beginning rather than continuation. She wanted a clear dividing line between the before and the after. She had earned it. There would come a morning, she knew, sometime in the weeks or months ahead, when she would drive out to the windbreak in the early dawn and stand among the cottonwoods one final time in the way she had always stood among them, without purpose beyond presence. She was holding that morning in reserve, the way you hold something precious that you are not yet ready to spend, wanting to arrive at it at the right time rather than the first available opportunity. It would come. She was patient. She had always been patient. The windbreak had taught her that patience was not passivity, had taught her that the deepest things do not announce themselves but wait, quiet and full, for the person who is willing to stop and look. She had stopped. She had looked. She had found what was there. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had been ready for a long time. The world was just now beginning to catch up. The agreement was signed on a Thursday morning in February in Margaret's office in the state capitol, at a conference table that looked out over a city still gray with winter. Cecilia had driven up the night before and stayed in a modest hotel 2 blocks from Margaret's office, not because she could not afford better, but because extravagance in the hours before a significant event had always felt wrong to her, felt like wearing someone else's clothes to a moment that belonged to you. She slept well. She had expected not to. She had anticipated the particular sleeplessness that accompanies things you have waited for a long time, the mind running ahead of itself, rehearsing what has already been settled. But she slept soundly and woke early and ate breakfast at a diner near the hotel, eggs and toast and coffee, and sat by the window watching the city move through its morning routines in the gray winter light, and felt, more than anything else, ready. Margaret greeted her at the office with the particular warmth of someone who has spent months in the trenches with another person and has come to respect not only their situation, but their character. She reviewed the final documents with Cecilia one more time, not because there was anything new to discover, but because her practice was thoroughness, and Cecilia's was the same, and they had both arrived at this moment through a disciplined refusal to leave important things to assumption. Every line was what it had been negotiated to be. Every protection was in place. The representatives of the extraction company arrived at 9 o'clock. There were 3 of them, a legal counsel, a commercial director, and a senior executive whose presence signaled the company's understanding of what the transaction represented. They were professional and cordial and carried with them the practiced neutrality of people who participate in significant negotiations as a matter of course. They shook hands. They sat down. The documents were arranged on the table. Cecilia read everything she signed, every page. She had made that decision before she arrived, and she held to it despite the polite impatience she could feel at the edges of the room, the subtle signals that professionals in these situations send when they want the ceremonial portions of a transaction to conclude and the operational portions to begin. She was not performing diligence for an audience. She was exercising it for herself, because she had learned over the preceding year that the person who reads everything is rarely the person who regrets anything. When she put her pen down after the final signature, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the extraction company's senior executive said, with what seemed like genuine admiration, that she had driven a harder negotiation than most landowners he had encountered, and that the terms she had secured were among the most favorable his company had agreed to in 15 years of operating in the region. Margaret did not react to this, but Cecilia caught the small, controlled movement at the corner of her mouth that meant she had heard it and was pleased. Cecilia thanked him. She said she had had excellent counsel. She looked at Margaret when she said it. Margaret looked back at her with the expression of someone who knows that excellent counsel and an excellent client are both necessary for an excellent outcome, and that credit, properly understood, belongs in both directions. They shook hands again. The representatives left. The office returned to its ordinary morning sounds, voices in adjacent rooms, traffic below the windows, the soft hum of machinery doing its work. Cecilia sat for a moment at the conference table after the others had gone, looking at the signed documents in front of her, at the copies that were now hers to take home, at the pages that represented the formal conclusion of a process that had begun with a strip of old trees no one wanted and ended here, in this room, with numbers that changed the shape of her life. She picked up the folder, stood, and put on her coat. Margaret walked her to the elevator. They said goodbye with the warmth of people who have been through something real together and know they will see each other again. As the elevator doors closed, Cecilia looked down at the folder in her hands. The upfront payment would be in her account within 72 hours. The first royalty payment would follow 18 months after extraction operations commenced, which was estimated to begin within the year. The payments after that would continue for 50 years, calibrated to production volume, adjusted for market conditions, protected by the terms she and Margaret had spent months securing. She walked out of the building into the cold February morning. The city moved around her. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, briefcase in one hand, the other hand empty at her side, and she breathed the cold air in and let it out slowly, watching it fog briefly in front of her face before disappearing. She thought about her father. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the morning she had walked into the Windbreak with a hand trowel and knelt in the cold soil beside the roots of the sentinel tree and found the ground darker and denser than it should have been. And had told herself she was imagining things, while some quieter, more reliable part of her had known she was not. She thought about all the mornings she had gone back. All the mornings she had walked those trees alone, in the dark before dawn, in the cold that bit through her jacket, in the wet of early spring and the heat of summer and the gold of autumn, just looking, just being present, just refusing to accept that what she had been given was worth nothing. She walked to her car and drove out of the city toward home. The drive back from the city after the signing took 3 hours. She drove without music, which was unusual for her. She was not avoiding sound so much as making room for the particular quality of silence that follows the completion of something long worked toward. The silence that comes after the last signature, when the machinery of a negotiation has run its course. And what remains is just a person in a car with the fact of what they have done. She had done it. It had been done. The road unrolled ahead of her toward the valley, and the valley received her in the flat, patient way it always had, indifferent to its own significance in her life. She stopped once on the way home at a gas station with a small attached diner, and sat at the counter and ate a piece of apple pie that was not particularly good, and drank a cup of coffee that was better than expected, and watched the afternoon light on the parking lot outside. The other people in the diner were in the middle of their own Thursdays, their faces carrying the ordinary preoccupations of people who have not just signed documents that changed the course of their financial existence. She found their ordinariness enormously comforting. The world was still the world. She was still herself. The pie was not particularly good. She had called no one during the drive. She wanted to arrive home first, to walk through the house that was hers and stand in each room and let the day settle into the space before she shared it with anyone else. She had earned the right to hold the news inside herself for a few quiet hours before it became something that involved other people's reactions and responses. The news was real. It would still be real after she had sat with it alone for one evening. The money arrived on a Saturday. She was at the new house, much in what would eventually be the kitchen, but was currently a room with bare walls and a temporary table and a kettle she had brought from the apartment when her phone showed the notification. She looked at it for a long moment. The number on the screen was the same number that had been in the agreement, the same number she had read on the signed page 3 days earlier, but seeing it in her bank account was different. Signed pages were documents. This was real. She set the phone down on the temporary table and made tea, and stood at the kitchen window looking out toward the northwest, in the direction she knew the Windbreak to be, though it was too far and the morning too overcast to see the tops of the cottonwoods. She drank the tea and thought about practical things, because practical things were where she lived and they were what she trusted. And the first practical question was what to do now, in the correct order, with the right priorities. She called Margaret first to confirm receipt and to discuss the recommended next steps for the financial management of the funds. Margaret referred her to a wealth management specialist she trusted, a woman in the city who had worked with resource rights recipients before and understood the particular financial landscape that came with royalty income, irregular, substantial, long-term, requiring different structures than the management of a static sum. Cecilia had a preliminary conversation with her that afternoon and scheduled a full meeting for the following week. She called her lawyer next, and to confirm that the first payment had arrived correctly and to review the timeline for the next phases of the agreement's implementation. He confirmed everything was in order. She thanked him and ended the call and sat down on the floor of the empty room, not because there was nowhere else to sit, but because the floor felt like the most honest place available, the closest thing to the ground. She sat there for a while. Outside, the winter light was pale and steady, the kind of light that shows everything clearly without warmth. She could hear the creek along the southern boundary of the property, faint but present. The same sound she had heard on her first visit, the sound of water doing its essential, unwitnessed work. She had bought this place partly for that sound. She was glad to hear it on this particular morning. The practical list was long, and she was glad of that too. There was furniture to acquire and walls to paint and a barn to assess for structural repair. There was the wealth management meeting to prepare for and the financial structures to understand, and the tax planning to begin. There was the foundation she intended to establish, her father's name over the door, its purpose the support of land, science education for young women from farming families, who had the attention and the patience and the skills that no one had yet thought to measure properly. There was the agricultural education organization to follow up with, and Teresa waiting for the call that would begin something Cecilia had been thinking about since September. There was the mentorship she had promised, and the knowledge she had acquired over the preceding year that she intended to share, because knowledge accumulated without being passed on was a kind of waste, and she had grown up in a family that understood the value of not letting useful things go to waste. She got up off the floor. She washed the teacup. She put on her coat and walked outside into the pale February morning, and stood in the yard of her new property and looked at what surrounded her, the fields, the bare winter trees along the creek, the wide flat sky above the valley, the particular quality of light that she had known all her life, and that had never, despite everything, stopped being beautiful to her. Spring arrived with its particular insistence, pushing through the cold with the combination of patience and force that spring always used, the ground softening incrementally, the light returning degree by degree, the first green appearing in places you had forgotten green could come from. Cecilia moved fully into the new house in March, bringing what she had from the apartment and supplementing it carefully, choosing things for the new rooms with the attention she had always given to things that would last. The first full morning she woke in the new house, she went to the kitchen window before making coffee and looked northwest. The sky was clear and cold, and the cottonwoods on the western edge of the Drummond farm were visible against the pale horizon, their enormous forms unmistakable even at distance, the bare branches holding the last of the night's darkness in their high canopy before the light reached them. She made coffee and stood at the window and looked at them for a while. They looked the same as they always had. They would look the same next year, and in 10 years, and in 50 years, long after the extraction operations had come and gone, long after every human drama associated with their roots had resolved itself into history. They were cottonwood trees. They did not concern themselves with what lay beneath them. They grew toward the light with the uncomplicated purpose of things that have been doing one thing well for a very long time. She had a great deal of affection for them. The foundation was established in April. It was called the Elias Drummond Land Science Foundation, and its stated purpose was the support of young women from agricultural families pursuing careers in soil, science, geology, mineral resource management, and land rights law. The founding endowment was enough to fund 10 full scholarships annually and to maintain a mentorship program that Cecilia intended to participate in directly. Teresa, from the Agricultural Education Organization, agreed to join the foundation's advisory board. She came to the first meeting in a state of barely contained energy that Cecilia recognized as the energy of someone who has been working toward something for years and has just been given the resources to reach it. They spent 3 hours at the table in Cecilia's new kitchen, the creak audible through the open window, going through the structure of the program, the criteria for participants, the partnerships that would need to be built with universities and extension services and industry bodies. Teresa had opinions about all of it, detailed and practical and well-founded, and Cecilia listened to every one of them and pushed back on the ones that needed pushing back on, and agreed readily with the ones that were simply right. By the time Teresa drove away in the early evening, the shape of something real had emerged from the afternoon. Cecilia sat at the table after she left and thought about the young women who would eventually benefit from what they had built that afternoon, women who did not yet know this foundation existed, who were currently on farms not unlike the one she had grown up on, doing work that no one was measuring in the currency it deserved, or carrying within them the qualities of attention and patience and care that the world had not yet thought to ask them for. She thought about what it would mean for one of them to receive a scholarship letter, to have someone she had never met look at what she was capable of and say that it was worth something. It meant everything. She knew exactly what it meant. The extraction operations began preliminary work in June. She was not present for the first day, having decided that watching the beginning of the physical process was not something she needed to do. She had done everything required to bring it to that point. She trusted the team and the agreement and the regulatory framework that governed what happened to her land. She went instead to the new barn, which she had spent 2 months repairing with the help of a local contractor whose work she trusted, and spent the morning doing the kind of quiet, physical work that had always been where she thought best. She was mending a section of the barn's interior framing that had dried out over the winter and needed reinforcement, a task that required patience and attention, but not complexity, the kind of work where your hands know what to do and your mind is free to be elsewhere. She thought about her father working on the farm in the early mornings before anyone else was awake. She thought about the way his hands had moved over equipment and structures, confident and unhurried, the hands of someone who trusted his ability to fix what needed fixing. She had his hands. She had always known that. She looked at them now holding the brace she was fitting into place, and recognized in them the same quality, the same particular combination of strength and precision that she had watched her whole childhood without ever thinking to connect to herself. She finished the repair. She stood back and assessed it. It was good work. She was satisfied with it. The county heard the extraction operations beginning the way it heard most things, through the particular network of observation and communication that connects people who live close to the land and to each other. The survey trucks on the road, the equipment arriving, the first physical marks of what was to come. People who had grown up watching the Drummond farm's western edge as the unremarkable strip of trees they had always taken for granted now slowed their cars when they passed it. Now they looked. The story circulated again, expanded and detailed now that the agreement was public record. People who had laughed at the inheritance settlement the previous year found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having been conspicuously wrong about something that had turned out to matter very much. Most handled it the way people usually handle that position, with a mixture of retroactive rationalization and genuine surprise. A few handled it gracefully, acknowledging directly that they had underestimated something, and that the underestimation had been their error rather than the fault of the thing they had dismissed. One of these was a man who had farmed adjacent land to the Drummond property for decades, a neighbor whose family had known Cecilia's family for 2 generations. He came to her house on a weekday morning and stood in her yard, and said he had been thinking about the Windbreak situation since the story broke, and he wanted to say plainly that he had been among the people who had heard about the inheritance and thought it was a shame, a way of saying she had gotten the short end without quite saying it, and that he had been wrong. He said he hoped she knew that people in the county were proud of her, though he understood if that sounded hollow coming from people who had not said so earlier. She thanked him. She invited him in for coffee. They sat at her kitchen table and talked for an hour about the farm, about the valley, about what the extraction operation would mean for the region and what it would not mean, because she was specific about both. She told him what she had learned about the process, what the environmental protections required, what the timeline looked like, what the royalty structure meant for the long term. He listened with the attention of a farmer, which meant he was looking for the practical truth beneath the general statement. And what he found was that she knew exactly what she was talking about. When he left, he shook her hand at the door. It was a different handshake from the one she might have received from him a year ago. She felt the difference and acknowledged it to herself without making more of it than it was. He was a decent man who had made an assumption and corrected it when the evidence required correction. That was all. It was not a rare quality, but it was a good one, and she respected it. Raymond visited the new house for the first time in July, on a Saturday afternoon when the summer was at its height and the fields lay heavy and green under a wide blue sky. He walked the property with her, the way farmers walk property, with attention to the ground and the structures and the water and the quality of the maintenance. He looked at the barn repair and nodded. He checked the drainage along the creek boundary and offered a practical suggestion about a section that could be improved. She made a note of it. They sat on the back step afterward with cold drinks and looked at the fields spreading out from the property's boundaries toward the horizon. The conversation moved through several things: the farm, the season, the ongoing work of all of their individual lives. He asked about the foundation, and she told him about Teresa and the first cohort of scholarship applications they were reviewing. He asked if she had thought about whether there was a connection between the foundation and the farm's educational programs, something about agricultural apprenticeships that the County Extension Service had been asking him about. She had not thought about that specific connection. She thought about it now. The County Agricultural Fair in August brought together the people of the valley in the way it did every year, with the organized bustle of people who have worked hard through a long season and have earned the right to show one another what they have done. Cecilia had attended the fair her whole life, first as a child walking the rows of exhibits with her father, then as an adult, with her own entries in the livestock and produce categories in the years when she had been more directly involved in farm work, and in recent years, simply as a visitor who liked the particular atmosphere of the thing. This year was different in ways she could feel without being able to precisely name. People greeted her differently, not with deference, which would have been uncomfortable, and not with the slightly guarded warmth of people who are not sure what to make of a changed circumstance. They greeted her with the directness of people who have had time to adjust to new information and have arrived at a stable new understanding. She was Cecilia Drummond. She had grown up here. She had received the trees and found what was beneath them. She had done something that people in this county would tell stories about for a long time. She was still herself. That last part mattered most to her. She had been worried during the months of the process about the way significant change can sometimes unmoor a person from who they had been before it, can make the self before the change feel like a version to be left behind rather than a foundation to be built on. She had watched that happen to people. She did not want it to happen to her. What she found, standing in the sunshine at the fair and talking to neighbors she had known for decades, was that it had not happened. She was the same person who had walked the windbreak in the pre-dawn with a hand trowel and a refusal to accept the assessment of others. She was simply that person with more resources and a clearer view of her own value. An elderly woman named Gertrude, who had known Cecilia's grandmother and had attended every fair in the county for 60 years, without obvious exception, found her near the jam and preserves exhibit and held her hand for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said that Elias would have been proud. She said it simply, as an old person says something they know to be true and see no reason to qualify. Cecilia thanked her. Her voice was steady. She was glad of that. It was a good idea. She told him so. He received the acknowledgement with the slight awkwardness of a man who was still getting used to being in a relationship with his sister where the ideas went in both directions. She let it be awkward. He would get used to it. When Darlene called in August to say that she had recommended the foundation to a colleague in her professional network, whose daughter was completing a degree in environmental geology and was looking for mentorship connections in the mineral resource sector. She said it in her businesslike way, presenting it as a straightforward referral rather than the gesture of reconciliation it also was. Cecilia received it as both because both were what it was, and she called the young woman the following week and spent an hour talking with her about the work. The young woman's name was Sophia, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been paying careful attention to the world for a long time, and was about to be given better tools with which to apply that attention. She asked smart questions and listened carefully to the answers, and asked follow-up questions that showed she had heard what had been said, rather than only what she had expected to hear. Cecilia thought about herself at that age, and what it would have meant to have someone who had navigated what she had navigated, willing to spend an hour on the phone talking through it honestly. She scheduled another call for the following month. Then she scheduled a third. The morning she had been keeping in reserve came in October, a year and a half after the survey, 13 months after the formal appraisal, 8 months after the signing. She drove to the Windbreak before dawn on a Sunday, when the valley was locked in the particular stillness of deep autumn, of the air cold and clear, and carrying the smell of turned earth and dried leaves, and the particular clean quality that comes when the growing season has completed itself and the ground has been given back to its own. She parked on the gravel track in the dark and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, listening. The windbreak was quiet around her. The cottonwood stood against the dark sky, their bare branches utterly still in the absence of wind. The stars were visible above the canopy, the kind of visibility that only comes far from city light, the whole deep field of them present and unhurried. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, and she pulled her coat tighter and walked north along the gravel track to the central cluster, to the old trees, the ones she had always come back to. The ground was firm beneath her feet, the roots of the cottonwoods raised and complex in the near dark, familiar by now in their particular patterns and positions. She had walked this strip enough times that her feet knew it the way feet know ground that has been walked many times. She stood among the oldest trees in the dark and was simply there. She did not think about the agreement, or the numbers, or the foundation, or the meetings, or the signed pages, or any of the practical architecture of what had been built over the preceding year and a half. She thought about her grandfather's hands in the soil, pressing small saplings into the ground that would become these enormous forms. She thought about her father walking this strip in the early morning, checking that the windbreak was doing its work, never knowing what it was also doing beneath the surface, what slow geological gift it was holding steady against all the years of wind and sun and frost. She thought about the first morning she had knelt beside the sentinel tree with a hand trowel and found the ground darker than it should be. She thought about all the mornings between that morning and this one, all the careful, patient, sometimes frightening work of building something real from a beginning that no one else had believed in. The survey, and the report, and the lawyer, and Margaret, and the negotiations, and the signing, and the first payment arriving on a Saturday, while she stood at a kitchen window looking northwest. All of it had led to this morning, and this morning was exactly what she had wanted it to be. She stood there until the sky began to lighten in the east, the darkness softening to gray, and then to the pale, clear blue of early dawn above the flat valley horizon. The cottonwoods emerged from the dark around her, their enormous trunks coming into definition as the light grew, their bare branches reaching upward with the unhurried confidence of things that have been growing for a very long time and intend to keep growing. She placed both hands on the trunk of the largest tree, the one she had played in as a child, the one above which the survey readings had been highest, the one whose roots reached deepest into the extraordinary geology of the valley floor. The bark was cold and rough beneath her palms. The tree was indifferent to her presence, as it was indifferent to everything, committed only to its own slow growth and the deep, patient work of its roots in the dark. She stayed there with her hands on the tree until the sun came fully above the horizon, and the light moved across the fields and reached the windbreak and touched the tops of the cottonwoods and made them gold. Then she stepped back. She looked up at the canopy one final time. She said something quiet that was not quite words, more the sound of someone completing a conversation that had been going on for a very long time. She walked back to the car. The gravel crunched under her boots. The morning light was full now, the valley bright and clear under the wide autumn sky, the fields on either side of the road, pale gold with the season's end. She started the car and sat for a moment before pulling out, looking at the windbreak in the rearview mirror. 12 acres, a strip of old trees that everyone had agreed was worth nothing, at the edge of her father's farm, the remainder after everything valuable had been taken. She pulled out onto the road and drove home toward her house on the parcel 2 miles north, where the creek was doing its quiet work along the southern boundary, and the barn was solid and repaired, and the kitchen window faced northwest, so that on clear mornings she could see the tops of the cottonwoods from exactly the right angle. People sometimes asked her, in the months and years that followed, what she would say to someone in the situation she had been in before the survey, before the report, before the numbers, in the period when she was simply the daughter who had received the trees, walking a strip of old growth in the early morning with nothing to show for it except the habit of attention. She went back to the windbreak in October again, 2 years after the first survey, and stood among the cottonwoods at dawn the way she had the previous October and the October before that. It was becoming a ritual, she understood, the way certain returns become rituals, not through deliberate planning, but through the recognition that a place and a time of year belong together, that some mornings can only be properly inhabited in one specific location. The extraction operations had altered the ground south of the central cluster, where the initial test operations had begun. There were structures now, modest and functional, set back from the tree line as the agreement required, and the sound in the morning was slightly different from what it had been, carrying within it the faint, distant presence of machinery doing its careful work. She did not resent the change. The machinery was there because she had negotiated for it to be there, under precisely the terms she had insisted on, and it was doing what she had agreed it should do. The cottonwoods were unchanged. The ground beneath her feet where she stood was unchanged. The deposit ran deep and would run deep long after the surface above it had been altered and restored and altered again in ways she could not predict. She placed her hands on the sentinel tree, as she always did. The bark was cold and rough and exactly itself. The tree had no opinion about what had happened in the preceding 2 years. It was growing, as it always had been growing, downward and upward simultaneously, its roots reaching toward the mineral richness of the valley floor and its branches reaching toward the light. It was doing the only thing it had ever been asked to do, and it was doing it well, and it had been doing it for longer than anyone living had been alive to observe it. She found this genuinely comforting. The tree's indifference was not cold. It was simply honest. Here was a thing that didn't need the situation to mean anything in order to continue doing its essential work. The meaning was hers to bring, and she brought it willingly, and then the tree let her have it back and kept growing. She always thought carefully before answering, because the question deserved a careful answer, and because she had learned, over the course of the preceding years, that the careless version of her story was useful to no one. The careless version said that she had been given something worthless, and it had turned out to be worth a fortune, and that the lesson was that overlooked things sometimes contain hidden treasure, and that you should look carefully at what you have been given. That version was true as far as it went. It did not go far enough. The careful version was harder to say and more important to hear. It was about the quality of attention she had brought to the windbreak, not the fact of the attention, but its quality. The willingness to look without agenda, without already knowing what she would find, without the protective assumption that familiar things contain no surprises. She had walked those trees her whole life. She had not truly looked at them until grief had slowed her down enough to see them clearly. Grief, she had learned, was one of the instruments through which life forced slowness on those who would not otherwise slow down. It was not a pleasant instrument, but it produced, in those who used it honestly rather than fleeing it, a quality of clarity that was difficult to achieve any other way. She had been slowed by grief, and she had turned that slowness toward her windbreak, and she had found what was there because she had finally, for the first time in her life, been still enough to look. She told this to the young women in the Foundation's mentorship program when they asked her what the key to her discovery had been. She told them that the key was not the survey, or the lawyer, or the geological knowledge she had acquired, or any of the practical tools she had used. Those things had been necessary. They had not been sufficient. The key had been the willingness to treat a dismissed thing as if it deserved serious attention, key to spend time and money and energy on a question that everyone around her had already decided was not worth asking. That willingness, she said, was not natural. It was not something she had been born with in greater quantity than other people. It was something she had developed over a lifetime of being told that what she held was not worth examining, and of deciding, quietly and without making a production of it, to examine it anyway. She told them that they were all, in one way or another, in possession of something that the people around them had decided was not worth examining. She told them that the people around them were almost certainly wrong. She told them to look carefully at what they had. She told them that the ground does not announce itself, that the most extraordinary things persist in silence, undetonated, and waiting for the right question. That patience is not passivity. That deep roots hold things that no one on the surface has remembered to account for. She told them that the windbreak had always been there. She had simply been the first one to stop and look at it like it mattered. Cecilia Drummond was 51 years old when the first full year of royalty payments was complete. She lived in the house on the parcel 2 miles north of her father's farm, with the creek along the southern boundary, and the barn her hands had helped repair, and the kitchen window that faced northwest. She drove to work 3 days a week and worked from the house the other 2, and had found, over the preceding 2 years, so that the particular balance of physical presence and private solitude suited her in a way that the long years of the apartment and the commute and the busyness had never quite managed to do. The Foundation was entering its second full year of operation. The first cohort of scholarship recipients had completed their initial year of study, and 2 of them had already reached out to Teresa about field placement opportunities that the Foundation's industry partnerships had helped create. Sophia, Darlene's colleague's daughter, had been offered a junior position at a geological survey firm that specialized in mineral resource assessment, and had called Cecilia the morning she received the offer letter to tell her about it. Cecilia had congratulated her and felt a quiet kind of pride that she had not expected to feel for someone she had known for less than a year. She came to understand her father better in the years after the settlement than she had during his life, which was perhaps the most common form of the understanding children develop of the parents they have lost. She understood that he had been a man who measured value in the language he knew, which was the language of productive land, of yield per acre, of market price and equipment cost, and seasonal risk. He had given her the windbreak not because he thought she deserved less, but because he had genuinely believed he was giving her something. He had measured it by the standards he had, and had found it wanting, and had offered it along with a private, unspoken hope that she would make something of it. She had made something of it, not in the language he had known, not in yield per acre or market price for feed corn, but in the older language of the ground itself, in the language of what the earth holds patient and unannounced in its deep geology, waiting for the particular question that will unlock it. She had spoken that language without knowing she was speaking it. She had been asking the right question long before she knew what the answer would be. She thought sometimes that this was the thing her father had loved most about her, though he had never found the words for it. The quality she had that none of her siblings had in the same measure. The willingness to stay with a thing after everyone else had moved on. The stubborn, quiet faith that what seemed unremarkable was often only unremarkable because no one had yet looked at it the right way. She forgave him. Not as a gesture or a performance, but as a fact. The way you accept a fact, when you have examined it from every angle and found it to be simply true. He had made assumptions that hurt her. He had also planted the windbreak, raised her on the land, taught her to walk boundaries and read soil and trust her hands. He had given her everything she needed to find what he never knew he had left her. That seemed, in the ledger of a person's life, like more than enough. She had dinner with Raymond and his family twice a month. The dinners were not easy in the way that dinners between people who have never had to work at understanding each other are easy. But they were honest, and they were regular, and she believed they were becoming something that would hold. Darlene came sometimes. Paul and Vivian came when they visited the county. The family was not repaired exactly, because repair implied returning to a previous state, and the previous state had not been one she wished to return to. What it was becoming was something new, something built with the knowledge of what had been, and the intention to do better. Phyllis had retired from the agricultural supplier in the spring. Cecilia had attended her retirement gathering and had given her, in a plain envelope, placed in her coat pocket without ceremony, a letter and a check. The letter said what needed to be said about 30 years of quiet steadiness and the particular gift of being seen at the right moments by the right person. The check was enough to mean something and not so much as to overwhelm. Phyllis had called the next morning, and the conversation had been brief and had contained a great deal. They had lunch together every 2 or 3 weeks at a place near Phyllis's house that had good soup and comfortable chairs and windows that faced the street. The extraction operations were proceeding on schedule. The royalty payments arrived with the regularity of things built on solid agreements and well-managed processes. She did not check her account obsessively. She reviewed it when it was relevant and trusted the structures that had been built to manage what flowed through it. The money was a tool. She used it for what it was for. She was not unchanged by what had happened. She would not claim to be. The scale of what the windbreak had produced, the formal transformation of her financial circumstances, the shift in how she was seen by her community and her family, these things left marks the way all significant experiences leave marks, not as wounds, but as the sediment of a life that has moved through something real. She carried the year of the survey with her, the way she carried everything that had shaped her, as part of the ground she stood on. What she was most grateful for was not the money. She would say that to anyone who asked, and she meant it with the precision that only people who have had the opportunity to test the claim can mean it. What she was most grateful for was the morning among the trees, the particular quality of her own attention in the pre-dawn cold, the decision to kneel in the soil beside the sentinel tree with a hand trowel and look at what the ground contained. The money had followed from that. The vindication had followed from that. All of it had followed from one woman, in the dark, paying careful attention to something everyone else had already dismissed. The second year of the Foundation Scholarship Program brought 12 applications from women across the region, nearly twice the number of the first year. Cecilia read all 12 personally. It took a weekend and a considerable portion of Monday morning. She was not the only person making the selection. Teresa and 2 other board members were involved in the process, but she wanted to know each applicant as a person rather than a file, wanted to understand the specific shape of each one's attention and patience and stubbornness before she cast a vote. What she found in those applications, in the personal statements and the letters of recommendation, and the specific, and detailed descriptions of the work each young woman was already doing in her family's fields, or on the land she had access to, was herself at 25 in various recognizable configurations. The same quality of careful observation, the same willingness to do unglamorous work without complaint, the same hunger for the tools to understand what they were already seeing, the same absence of any sense that what they held was worth examining, because the world around them hadn't yet told them it was. She approved 7 of the 12. Teresa approved the same 7. The board member dissented on 1, and they discussed it and arrived at 8. 8 young women who would spend the next year building the knowledge and the connections and the confidence to ask the questions they had been carrying, unvoiced, for years, on 8 futures that would go differently than they might otherwise have gone. She wrote each of them a short personal note with the offer letter. Not a form letter. A specific note for each one, responding to something in their application that had particularly struck her. She told one of them, a young woman from a farm in the eastern section of the valley, whose personal statement had described the way she had mapped the drainage patterns on her family's property over 3 seasons, without being asked and without telling anyone, that what she was already doing was exactly the work the field needed. She told her to keep doing it. She told her the ground was worth the attention. She meant every word. She meant all of it. She thought about that often. She intended to keep thinking about it. It seemed to her the most important thing she knew, and she had made it her practice to return to important things regularly, not to dwell on them, but to keep them close, the way you keep close the things that are worth carrying. The Windbreak still stood on the western edge of the Drummond farm. Raymond looked after it now, not because he had to, but because she had asked him to, and because the asking had felt, to both of them, like the right gesture. The extraction operations worked around the root systems of the oldest trees with the care specified in the environmental agreement, and the cottonwoods grew on as they always had, indifferent and patient, and committed to their own slow deepening. She drove past them most days. She did not always stop. But she always looked. There was always something to see, if you looked carefully enough. She had learned that, and she intended to spend the rest of her life practicing it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.